Welcome everyone, I've closed in my shapes and now I'm going to just lightly erase some of the lines so that way they don't overpower the paint that I'm going to have on the top. This is how much paint I start with. I'm going to start my 5 value portrait and I've got my reference photo here and I've got my watercolor paper all done and I've got my palette. And I showed you before with a photo how much paint I've got in there. So I'm starting there with my used palette, since it's going to be in black and white, just a value painting in black, whites, and grays. I'm going to be using my grayscale palette and reusing this paint here. So I'm starting out with, I've got 4 different brushes here from my 4-brush set that I had you guys get on your supply list. So I'm starting out with these 5 brushes. They're all dry. And I just am going to decide what part of this I want to paint first. And I feel like painting the bow in her hair. But before I do that, I'm going to paint the hair around it so I have it nice and outlined. And I feel like I should be using this medium brush. I've got a little teeny tiny brush and a larger brush and a flat brush. I'm going to use the medium brush. And so the first thing I'm going to do is shape up that tip with water. So I've got my clean water out and my dirty water out. The dirty water is for cleaning off my brushes. My clean water is for mixing my paint up. Right now, because I'm just starting, they're both clean. So I'm going to start out here and just tap some water into there. I think I'm going to use a larger brush because a larger brush will put more water in there. I'm going to tap some water into my black pan here, my white pan, so I can mix up my values. I'm just going to wet these up a little so I've got something to work with here. Alright, so I've got those, a nice amount of water in there. And that's all I did, was just put water in there. And I'm going to brush that off. Now because I want to get a nice even line here with my brush, I'm going to just take my brush and roll it so that way I've shaped the tip of it. And I've decided I'm going to paint that in a value that's almost black. So I'm just going to go to the black section of my palette here and start mixing up some of this paint. Getting it wet so it moves around. Looks like I had some paint over there. I'll stick that over here so I can use it too. Well, this is a solid black. I'm going to just go over here to the other section of my palette and still some of this mid-gray here because I don't want to go in a solid black, but I don't want it too light either. So I'm just going to mix some of that already dark gray in with my solid black, and that's going to give me the value that I'm looking for. I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm getting in there and shaping my brush again, and I'm going to go in and just lay down that value inside my shape. So here we go. I've already erased my lines, but they're still somewhat just slightly visible because I want to be able to know where my shapes are, but I want to make sure that they want to make sure I can still see my shapes so that way I know where I had planned to place my values. painting that in. I'm running out of paint, I know, because my brush strokes aren't, I can feel the resistance, I can feel the dryness of the brush, I can feel it drying out. Alright, so I've got one of the shapes in that I want. Let's look and see if that's really what I wanted. Yeah. I'm going to do that. And then I've just got it nice and painted in. So that's the first thing that I've got painted in so far. You see, I'm doing the wet into dry technique because I want to have my shapes nice and controlled. So now that I've done that, I want to paint a little more of the hair and feeling excited about it. So I'm going to go in and paint a little more. Going in here, and this is just slightly lighter than the value that I've already put down. Get into my dirty water. Feel like I want it to be just a little lighter than it's going down right now, so I'm adding a little white to it and placing that in the shape next to it. I'm on my way. Yeah, so I'm really a lot happier with that value that I'm going with the second value I've decided with. That's going to go all the way down the side of her head here. I'm doing in her hair where I decided her hair was, where the breaks in plain were, where the breaks in value. Okay, I think I can be happy with this. I'm almost finished here. And I've got that in there. I'm going to just clean my brush out here, and there's my second value in. So now it's a good time to maybe move to a different part, and the only reason I'm moving to a different part is because I want to let that dry and I don't want these to bleed too much. I thought I was going to start with that bow, but I went in with the dark part first, so I'm going to go in and do some tones in the bow too. So with this one, I'm just looking to match the tone that I feel like I'm seeing here, and going in with my brush and drawing in that shape with my brush and keeping the tone, the value, all one tone. Okay, I can live with that. This is another shape I can fill in. All right. I'm going to avoid that for a little while. I'm going in and filling in this shape back here. And this is just describing the forms and folds in the bow with a value structure that I decided was going to be the one that I used for here. This one I'm going to go in a little darker because it's further back in space. So that puts it more into shadow. And there is that in the bow. Now I've got another one here. I'm looking here and I'm seeing that my paper is dry enough now because it's not reflecting anymore with the light. So I know now that it's dry enough that I can put another value in down here without it getting bleeding into the hairline, because if you put wet paint down and the paint next to it, or the paper and the paint are still wet, it will bleed right into there. So there's that. Then I need a little lighter gray for this extra fold back here. So I'm going in there and playing with positive and negative space, and that's what I use to determine what my shapes were. So I can go in here where I've got a slightly lighter value that I'm trying to replicate, and leaving part of that bow in there white. So there's the shape I defined before, looking at that, and going back in on itself. And there we are. I've got some of the forms of my bow done already. So there's that. Then I'm going to go in and define her chin by painting in her underneath her chin, painting in her chest area. So all of that one, I have decided I was going to have that as just one value. You see the cloth I have underneath my hand, and that's just to keep the oil from my hands off of my painting. So there's that. I've got this drawn out, and I'm just going in and outlining her chin. So I keep that nice and clean, keep the lines that I wanted in there. So you see I've just gone in there and done a nice little outline move. Now I'm going to fill that in with the same value. And I just stay inside of the shape because it will the paint won't go where there is no water. So with doing that border in there first, it allows me to restrict the paint from moving outside of the shape that I'm looking to paint. So now I'm going to do a little piece of her shoulder back here, her other shoulder, and that's going to help define her little strap on her clothes, her little shoulder strap on her dress, on her little dress here. Alright, just cleaning that off. I'll show you this. I've got several values down there now, and you can see I'm using very, very, very little paint. So I still have some of the water and my palette from moving that around, but you can see I've used very, very, very little paint. Right now it's moving around. But that's okay. It's just going to, I'll just be able to move it back around the way I want it to and mix up the values, just put it back where I want it in the palette. So I've got another mid-tone here for the side of her face. I'm going to put that in. And this one's a lot lighter than her hairline. So it looks like I had thought about going in too dark at first, but I want to make sure I get those relative values right. So I'm not going to go in as dark as I initially had felt I was going to use. I'm going to use a lighter value in my palette and just trace that shape that I had mapped out earlier and paint that shape in. So I'm using the white of the paper to do some of the work for me. That's one of the good things about working with a water-based paint, and especially one like gouache or watercolor, where you can use the tone of the paper to give you some of the values that you're looking for. Because of its transparent nature, you can use the white of the paper to influence your value and let the white of the paper reflect from underneath the paint you've put down. So that's my darkest spot on her face. That's still pretty wet. Now that I'm looking at it, it's fairly wet. So I'm going to let that dry. I feel I could go back in and do a little bit more with the bow right now, but I'm not sure what's going on here. So I've got a picture of this on my phone, and so I've got her on my phone, and this is going to let me see what's going on with that bow and where because I was a little confused on what I did here, and now I see what I did and I understand what I have to do here. So I've got this is still wet here. I'm going to avoid that area and make sure I don't touch it, and go back in and put in this shape in here that will help me define the folds and such in this bow. So that's what I'm doing here, is establishing that value there in the bow so I can give it gives it a sense of form, even though I'm using a very limited palette. So, okay. Then this gets a very light treatment. I'm just going over that with a very light touch, since this isn't going to be all white back here. I'm just going over it to give it a very, very light value. I'm going to leave that part white back there. This is practically just a light gray wash with mostly water. And so you can go right over the dark you put in before with a lighter color value. pardon me, it is value. And it'll give you a nice, it'll cover it, but because it's lighter, it's not going to, or it's going to add a little bit of depth to the value you already have down there, but not so much that it's going to overpower it, because the light color doesn't really influence when you paint over a dark value. Again, I'm saying color, but I really mean value. Okay. So that's about it for what I'm going to be doing on the bow. And now I'm going to just work a little bit more in her face and her hair. So I'm going to play with the hair here. I think I'm going to be going darker in here because I need to go darker, because now that I've put down the darkness in this side of her face, I see that I need to go darker in her hair, so that way I have the contrast I need to describe the shapes of her face that I'm looking to describe. Because I still am making this where it does, even though it's only 5 different values and it's minimalized down to this idea of just shapes, I still want the form and the image and the person to be recognizable. So and to make sure I achieve that, I'm using the local values that I see and abstracting those shapes down within her face. But keeping them in the same value structure, relative, averaged out value structure that I see in real life. I'm just dropping a little bit more of that in, since it's already wet. It allows me the paint to disperse. Taking that in where I know I've got room to go in there, dropping in, just taking some darker paint and dropping it in there and letting it disperse on the wet little area that I already put in there, making sure it stays within that area. So there we are. I did a little nice refined shape in there. I'm gonna let that dry out. And now I'm gonna go back in and make that hair darker where I initially thought I was going to go with a deep gray. I see that I can go in with a solid black and be happy with that. So I'm gonna go in and make this value a little more deeper, and that's going to give me latitude, as they say, or room to get some deeper relative tones too. Because in art, everything is definitely relative, and like proportions are relative when you're trying to make something look representational. Values are relative. And they're relative to the other elements within your image. So the image you're trying to create, it does have relative values in it. So that looks great. I'm really happy with that. I'm going to come back in here and let that shape emerge and go in here and make that darker. making sure I stay within the lines. That's why I'm still using this same brush. I'm feeling like I have a decent amount of control over it. So I'm going into my dirty water, because it's okay to go into your dirty water when you're painting black, because it's not going to muddy up or darken up your values, so it's not going to interfere with your plan. So here we go. And I had these nice little refined shapes that I wanted to get that describe her hair, the movement in her hair. And so I went in and did those refined shapes first, and then I can go back in and I've got more, I can do a much more casual approach to the larger areas. So going back in here, I can do an outline on the back of her head. Take that little piece of hair, and now I'm going to take more water, and I've got all of that empty space. I've got it all outlined, and I'm just going to fill it in like my own fun little personal coloring book. So I'm getting over it so I can see what it is that I'm actually painting because of my angle to the light. So you've got room to go in darker. Because I'm painting so light with I'm not using a whole lot of paint. When it dries, it does dry a little lighter, so I'm just going back in once it does dry and putting another nice little layer over that without agitating the bottom layer too much, and getting that value that I'm actually looking for. So they're starting to get some nice movement. I see her little face coming forward, and I'm just going to keep on painting. So I know I want this dark value, which is going to be my blackest black down here on this side of her head. And I'm just putting those in like that, just following both the shapes that I put in and what I'm actually seeing right now here, using them both as reference to get my painting, my design to look the way I want it to. So that moved around. I'm going back in and making it dark. You see, I just carefully dipped my brush in that water because I don't want to oversaturate my brush. I want to make sure I can keep the flow controlled. Going back over my black areas where it's all solid black and making that a little darker because, again, it faded a little when it dried. Some of the paper is showing through and reflecting and making it look a little more gray, and I want it to have that nice solid black fill, so that way it'll be darker than my dark grays that I'm going to be putting next to it. So there we go. I've got that black in there. I got really deep the way I wanted it to. And again, you can see I still have not used that much of the paint relative to what I started with. I haven't even dipped in that little side dish of black over there that I have. So I'm going to paint this a little more, and I will keep recording it. I'm going to go in here a little darker with that shape. Darken this up because I want, again, I want my values to fall in line with the average value of the area that I'm painting. So the area I'm painting, I defined it with a shape. So there, I darkened that. Ideally, you can see that it's a nice deep gray tone in there now. And that's going to give me that nice contrast that I'm looking for with that darkness of her skin that I put in. So I've got, this is dry enough in here now that I can go in and put in my second value. That's up next to that black. And I've got another area where it comes down here. And goes back around here. Make sure I don't cross into other areas where I don't belong. So this way I can, that's going to be the shape of her ear, and I want to be able to retain that. So that's one of the reasons you want to stay in the line, is because you want to retain the shapes that are going to make your image look the way you actually want it to. So then I'm going in with a lighter mid-tone. It may be a little too early because that paint in there is wet. So I'm going to leave that section alone. And I'm going to fill in the shapes in her ear that'll define the structure of her ear. And I'm going to use one of the mid-tones that I've got in here, a deep mid-tone, and just drop that down into the little shape. And my shape does come out and has a very narrow edge there. This is here, and it's the same shape. You see I'm going very slow and controlled. So this way my paint does what I want it to, and it doesn't do what it wants to, which is have no control. And feel like I can make that shape a little different. There we go. And so then now I've got the two shapes in there that are going to define some of the structure in her ear. This in here is going to be a very light shade of gray. And then this in here is going to stay white, like the value of the paper. And I'm just going to use the value of the paper and keep that white. And that'll be my lightest value. So here I'm not too worried about going in and going over that shape next to it, because the shape next to it is going to be darker. So if I get some of that light value in there, it's not going to destroy what I'm trying to do, because it's you can always go darker over a light value. So now I'm just going in with a tone that's deeper than that value I put in on the side of her face, and I'm going in and laying that in for part of her hairline, and then coming down the side of her face over here with that light value too. Going in a little deeper with that one deep shape, going in with a little deeper value in there too, right next to it. And I'm just taking my brush and bleeding that out there. And I'm going to leave that one white and just come down with this value in here. All of this is going to be dark in here. You know, this is going to be darker in here. You can all just go in, and gives me an average value, but I'll be able to go back in and darken up the spaces that I really want darker, like I'm doing with the dark space that I put in earlier, because I want to make that a little deeper. So I'm going back over it and increasing the strength of the value that I had put in there. So that's where it is now. This is what she looks like now. I might need to let it dry a little more. So before I get back in there, I know I'm going to go in deeper with in this value and this structure that separates her nose from her cheek, that fold there. Go in darker with that, and I'm going to go in darker here too, and make that shape in there a little darker. All right, so there's that. I will be going in and playing with this in here in her cheek, defining that. Going in with that same light value that I used for the side of her face. Super light value. This is all going to be darker in here. So I'm going to be okay with going in and just taking this value over, because I know I want all of this in here darker. And then I'll go in and darken up those, pick out those shapes and darken them up when I'm ready to put more details in. And go on this side of that and fill in that shape with a value lighter than I intend to finish with. And that's what she's looking like now. So I'm going to let this dry a little. So you see I've developed a nice value structure here, And you see how much paint I used? Not that much paint at all. Thanks for watching.